Let me begin with a quick note of apology, a quick one but a sincere one for kind of keeping everybody on their toes, especially my other 5 colleagues who were wondering if I'm going to show up or not. I almost did not. True story, I had a friend, and I should start my timer. It's not going over 40. True story, this is, hopefully it'll come within the 40 minutes. I had a friend whose older brother was slotted to get married, and his older brother got scared. At the very last moment, he didn't show up to the wedding. And my friend, the younger brother, married the woman. True story. I almost did not show up this morning, but I have no brother in Winnipeg, so I had to just come late. So I'm sorry, but I'm here. It is a delight and honor to deliver this lecture titled Theological Interventions Amidst Forces of Death. The lecture, you heard this before, but I think it's worth repeating again, is part of a new first-year undergraduate offering at Canadian Mennonite University, CMU, called Ways of Knowing 1, that invites students into the heart of CMU by involving them in an interdisciplinary course that gets faculty and students thinking theologically together about an issue of current concern. The course consists of seminars, roundtable discussions, and 3 public lectures. This year's big question is, what are people for? In responding to this question that could also be phrased as, what does it mean to be human? My lecture offers this response, namely, being human means making interventions amidst forces of death. I will first start by describing what I mean by forces of death. Second, I note some problems with coming to terms with such forces of death. And third, I propose some theological interventions. 2, if you're wondering how many 2. I used to be like a 3 kind of guy, but now I'm 2. I must also note that my remarks will contain a few references to injustice, and this is on a serious note, including sexual abuse and murder. So I encourage you to just be kind to yourself and others around you. And as Janet already mentioned, if you need support at all, professionals from student life are at the back of the auditorium for conversation, for assistance. Just do keep that in mind. Forces of death. In my work, I have described forces of death as structural wrongs. Structural wrongs that operate as forces of death are injustices of various kinds that have inherited their discriminatory logic from culturally, religiously, or legally sanctioned codes from the past. Much of my research yes, it works, seeks to understand how structural wrongs operate today. Not if, but how. Take, for instance, something like patriarchy. My question would not be if patriarchy exists, but rather how patriarchy operates in the world. Some of you might recall the government report released in the year 2022, just last year, which revealed that a quarter of the women serving in the Canadian military complained of being sexually assaulted during their military careers. That's every 4th woman in the Canadian military. Someone put it well when they acknowledged that the very institution charged with protecting and defending our country has not always protected and defended its own members. That is some cruel irony, isn't it? When I arrived in Winnipeg in 2020, I noticed that Manitoba car license plates advertised Manitoba as friendly Manitoba. Now, people in Manitoba were actually friendlier than people in Boston, where we came from. So there's something to that. But after a few months in, right, I saw posters kind of go all up around the CMU campus that outlined statistics of intimate partner violence. And guess what? Friendly Manitoba has one of the highest incidents of intimate partner violence. So I set out to do some research. You got to fact find yourself, right? So I set out to do some research to figure out why all these women were physically assaulting these men. And to my surprise, it was the other way around. It was the men perpetrating the violence against women. Patriarchy exists. We can just go ahead and acknowledge that. But what's vital to remember, I think, is that patriarchy did not appear overnight. It was well curated and crafted carefully over hundreds of years by culture, by religion, and legal sanction. Take legal sanction, for instance. Women were barred by Canadian law from voting until the year 1916. White women, that is. Now, indigenous women gained the right to vote only as recently as 1960. They sound similar, but they're very different. 1916 and 1960. Layers of patriarchy with an icing of racism is what I want to call it. Layers of patriarchy with an icing of racism. Who would like a bite? Okay, so here's the thing. Here's the thing. Most of us think, including me, that we are not eating from the cake of patriarchy or racism. But what we do collectively as a society might indicate otherwise. It is worth our time then considering how violent pasts continue to shape our identity and habits. And here's where we encounter another problem. And this brings me to the second part of the lecture, namely that there are people who think that forces of death are not really a problem. The argument goes something like, maybe there are violent pasts, but that's, all in the past. Such denial of forces of death might be termed, to use a word from a philosopher by the name Harry Frankfurt, a bullshit. He observes that one of the most salient features of our culture is that there is so much bullshit. He says, everyone knows this. Each of us contributes their share, but we tend to take the situation for granted. Now, Harry Frankfurt continues. He says most people are rather confident of their ability to recognize bullshit and avoid being taken by it, and therefore, the phenomenon has not aroused much deliberate concern nor attracted much sustained inquiry. I think philosopher Frankfurt is onto something here. Bullshit is what happens when we have butter and cream all over our faces and we yet continue to convince ourselves that we are not eating cake. In a few minutes, I'll get into a description of how racism operates in this way, that is, making us think that we are beyond racism while we are actually caught in its vortex. Before that, I think it would be good to spend a bit of time considering an example that illustrates Frankfurt's point about bullshit. Let me offer one from Kate Bowler's wonderful book, No Cure for Being Human. The saying, unleash positive thoughts, get rid of negativity, is a pervasive form of bullshit. I have to admit that some Christians are infamous peddlers of this thinking. These peddlers are clever people. They know that people struggle with negative stuff, the weight of the world. It's hard to bear, isn't it? Wouldn't it be nice if that weight of the world was lifted somehow? But here's the catch. Suffering imposed by oppressive structures cannot be wished away with good vibes. In discussions of equity, diversity, and inclusion, there is a word that is used to describe such positive thinking that disregards suffering imposed by oppressive structures. It is called toxic positivity. Let me tell you a story. I once visited an Indian American church in Boston. And don't worry, I have Winnipeg examples coming. And I visited this Indian American church, and I sat at a table with 5 others during coffee hour, and someone asked me what my research interests were. Structural wrongs, I said. A medical doctor who was at the table interjected immediately and said, "Everyone has a complaint these days. Everyone has a grouse. Everyone is a victim." Wow, that escalated quickly, I thought. I then clarified that I was talking about structural injustice. But this doctor guy was still upset. I could see it in his body. He said he couldn't hold it in any longer. So he butted in and he asked a question. Who is the voice of God in America? Who is the voice of God in America? He asked rhetorically a few times. So I gave him a considered theological response. I said, it could be any of us. I said, really, there's a story in the Bible that God spoke to this person named Balaam through a donkey no less. So it is possible that the voice of God could be anybody, right? But the doctor was not satisfied with this theological response. So he repeated his question one more time. Who is the voice of God in America? And then he went on immediately to state, it is a black guy, Morgan Freeman. The voice of God in Hollywood is a black guy, and you still want to complain? It's all about one's attitude. So according to this well-educated brown man, was just as brown as I was, just because Morgan Freeman's voice is portrayed as the voice of God in a Hollywood film, there is no racism in society. Apparently, we should all just put out some good vibes and unleash some positive thoughts, and racism will have disappeared just like that, and everything will be okay. If Harry Frankfurt, that philosopher, was around today, I think he'd say, I think you got it. The doctor is unable to see how his own presumably innocent statement, from his perspective, can in fact be humiliating to and disrespectful of a great number of people who continue to suffer the harms of racism. Disentangling ourselves from bullshit is a big part of the intervention amidst forces of death. Forces of death are amidst us. They inherit their force from the violence of the past, a violence that continues to cast its long shadow in our own time. Hannah Arendt, a name that you might be familiar with, a philosopher who wrote about the human condition, noted how evil, forces of death, are often banal, by which she meant that sometimes we encounter injustices as just ordinary. In other words, forces of death, although they certainly can be encountered in all their horrendous brutality by those who are harmed by such injustice, are at other times not encountered as brutal. In other words, boring, thoughtless, ordinary. Thus allowing such injustices to be viewed as something other than a force of death. This is a most insidious thing. I said I'll say something about Winnipeg, so let me do that. So me and my family came to Winnipeg in the fall of 2020, and our daughter was beginning her elementary school education. Elementary school, that time in which our precious little ones step into the world with their eyes wide open, expecting good things from the world, anticipating kindness. Our daughter began in this way as well. And it was quite nice, actually. In her kindergarten class, all the kids got invited to everybody's birthday party. It was just wonderful. The number of birthday parties I went to is just extraordinary. And all the kids got invited to, like every other kid got invited to every other kid's birthday party. We parents often reflected on this and thought this was just a beautiful thing. And we ought to enjoy while it lasts. Isn't that what they say about ice cream? You got to enjoy it while it lasts because it's bound to melt. As these kids progress into further levels of elementary school and beyond, they would, as we ourselves did in our time, begin to form their own little groups based on all kinds of perceived differences. But they were okay for now, or so we thought. But you know, how do I say this? White people were doing their thing. So the white parents, right, would congregate with other white parents, and they'll be all chatty, and they'll be exchanging shoes and socks and stuff. It's really very interesting to watch. In a short time, these white parents exchanged so much information about their kids that they knew their kids' clothes sizes, shoe sizes, rain jacket sizes, snowsuit sizes. It's just amazing. They could share clothes, they could arrange play dates, play together in the park, and so on. And the rest of the parents who were not white, we did a range of things, right? So some of us found our own little colored pockets. Some just stood on the sidelines and watched all the nonsense from a distance, while another one or two, and this is really sad, but in predictable fashion, they tried really hard to be nice to the white people who were not really nice to them. As for me, I did all of those things. Confession, I did all of those things because, I love my daughter and I wanted to have a good experience at school. Something you unfortunately cannot really control, but still, we try, right? So one day, a white mother comes up to me and says, "Hey, my child would like to have a play date with your child." And so we set up a time to meet and found a time to meet at the park, and then we showed up. And then we see that there are a couple more of our daughter's white classmates' parents. Nothing wrong with that, but bear with me as I make my point. And there were a couple more other white parents with their white kids who also showed up at the park. And I thought, that's a curious coincidence. I discovered, kind of by accident, right, just kind of by accident, that these white mothers actually had a little texting group. So I wouldn't know this now, but a white mother unintentionally told me the secret. So what they do is whenever one person takes their child to the park, they'll text each other, right? They'll text each other, the white mothers. And so all the white kids can play together. Surprise, surprise. So I should have been kind of grateful, I suppose, that my brown child got invited. After all, it was a one-time invitation only. Our phone number never got added to the texting group. Now, why I say this is, now these white kids who are otherwise in a diverse classroom, really, believe me, in that kindergarten class at my daughter's school is one of the most diverse classrooms I have seen, right? So these white kids who are otherwise in a diverse classroom see this white organized playtime, kids of only one skin color. These kids kind of look around and see an all-white cohort where the parents are hanging out with each other, laughing, sharing personal stories, bonding, and the other stuff, they're exchanging free stuff. And the next day at school, these same white mothers are smiling, they're talking to each other, the ones who were just hanging out the previous day. But the smiles are not as visible when they look at the yellow, brown, and red parents' faces. Now you tell me, when these little white kids watch their parents do this nonsense, right, and they see this happening around them, I ask the question, and I want you to ask the question, what ideas are they forming about themselves, about others, about the world? This is how I think that these white kids start believing that they are more special than others, owning space, feeling entitled, and then they fall prey to this very unfortunate but very real way in which some lives become more valuable than others. This is how racism kind of gets brewed in many families without anyone thinking, and here's the interesting thing, without anyone thinking that they are intentionally raising white kids or intentionally raising racist kids. These same parents, my guess is these same parents also love Dr. Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. You remember that one? Where the little white kids and the little brown kids and the black kids and all that, they kind of walk hand in hand. Except that those dreams never materialize because they are living the nightmare of racist habits that's going to take more than a few good quotes from Martin Luther King to undo. And here's another fun fact. I bet you these same white parents would wear orange shirts this week. Shirts that read "Every child matters." It happens. I have found that it happens sometimes. Indigenous theologian Vincent Solomon of Norway House Cree Nation, who spoke to the CMU community at chapel on Friday last week as part of the 2023 National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, noted how residential schools in Canada were factories of death. They certainly were. Residential schools in Canada existed from the 17th century all the way to the 1990s as part of a violent assimilation effort to remove Indigenous children from their traditional homes and cultures and destroy their ways of life. Michelle Good of Red Pheasant Cree Nation, in her book, Five Little Indians, describes a little girl, Lucy's experience at residential school. Poignantly combining history with fictional storytelling to make her point, Good describes Lucy's physical and emotional trauma. I quote, "Lucy ran her hand through her hair, her fingers outlining the raised and rugged scars from sister's favorite punishment. Punishment for what? For nothing. For being a little kid. Forces of death don't allow kids to be kids. Forces of death rob us all of our humanity. Forces of death operate in such a way that some lives and bodies are treated as being more equal than others. These same forces of death allow certain bodies to be taken before their time, bodies that are murdered and go missing. And no one is searching. How is that acceptable? How is it acceptable, as our Indigenous siblings ask us, that despite knowing that the bodies of missing and murdered Indigenous women are in a Winnipeg landfill, that her search has not yet begun? The responses from those who have the power to do something have an interesting range. Some say, too dangerous. Others note that the area is too big, it's not feasible. A search is not feasible. As for me, I am with Anishinaabe scholar Nigan Sinclair on this particular topic. It comes down to the financial costs associated with the search. According to the report released by the Landfill Search Feasibility Study Committee, while costs for a search may be high, the cost of not doing a search, Sinclair notes, needs to be considered as well. Not choosing to search could send a message that disposing of victims in dumpsters is a good method for perpetrators, as one that comes with impunity. Sinclair notes soberly on his own commentary, it costs all of us when a society decides some lives are more valuable than others, forces of death. It is truly a heartbreaking situation when injustices against women, for instance, are seen as a problem that women have to handle primarily. When injustices against Indigenous people are seen as their problem. when the suffering of others kind of fades away in the background as we go about our daily lives. It really is utterly devastating when we forget our primordial ties that all of us have with each other. When we forget those primordial ties with one another and allow things like gender and race to come in the way of mutual love and care. The things that we do with our bodies, the way we perceive other bodies, react in particular ways, how we feel, how we think in the presence of other bodies or in the absence of other bodies, we must, I believe, pay attention to these bodily habits. Theologian Willie Jennings, who you will see in October on CMU campus, notes how everyone is caught up in an exhibition that pushes us always toward isolation. Kathleen Dean Moore, Ways of Knowing One, students will recognize that name, an author we have read in our course, notes similarly, the economic forces of our lives are centripetal, tending to spin us in smaller and smaller circles away from each other. And in these increasingly smaller circles, the reality is that we find mostly ourselves in proximity with others who look like us, who talk like us, who eat like us, who think like us, who are more like us than they are different. Shelley Turkle, author of a thought-provoking book titled Alone Together, references a study that reveals a 40% decline in empathy among college students over the past 30 years. If that trend of 40% decline over 30 years continues, can you imagine how much empathy we would have left in the next 50 to 70 years? But I truly am hopeful. You know why? Here's where Turkle is interesting and theological interventions become exciting. The researcher of that particular study that showed this decline in empathy wondered aloud if the solution, right? She's talking about technology and stuff. So she's wondering if the solution to address the decline in empathy is to create, guess what? An empathy app. An empathy app. That should do it. Sherry Turkle disagrees. Sherry Turkle disagrees and offers instead a really gentle but firm reminder to readers that sums up her advice for broadening our individual and collective imaginations. We are the empathy app, she says. That's you and me, folks. We are the empathy app. As we consider that, as we consider how we might be the empathy app, let me offer a theological insight or two that could possibly help us in our empathizing. Indigenous theologian Carmen Lansdowne, another theologian we read in our course, Ways of Knowing One, member of the Hailsick First Nation, notes how multiculturalism as a model is limiting because a multicultural society, while it might have certain positive optics, does not embody an authentic mutuality. Think of it like the pictures you see on brochures, right? You can kind of stick a brown face next to a white face and get a nice multicultural cover image. But a mere assortment of white dots and brown dots and black dots and red dots and yellow dots and other dots do not make us a beloved community. It takes more. Lansdowne would argue that what we need is interculturalism, where we have mutually reciprocal relationships among and between people of different cultures, focusing on deep connections, not superficial connections, in which no one is left unchanged, where racial and cultural power imbalances are addressed, where both oppressor and oppressed, the dominant and the marginalized, see their need for liberation from systems of oppression that as necessity requires interdependence, you and I together. The question, how might we overcome isolating forces of death, is a deeply theological question. Theologian, Tinker of the Osage Nation, argues rightly that our movement for liberation must be a spiritual movement as much as it is a political one. Others have noted similar things. Learning how to live with one another on this planet is more than a matter of being politically correct. It's more than naive optimism. It is a matter of our collective survival. We need a spiritual and moral reawakening in order to live peacefully together in this world house, in what could be a beloved community. But as the authors here note, we also need to be willing to roll up our sleeves and help build or restore this world house. We need to continuously reimagine our sense of togetherness. So here are two concrete theological proposals. The first one is that we relearn to treat our bodies as sacred. Not just some bodies, all bodies. And here's where I get my theological inspiration from. Christians believe that a great miracle happened. You guessed that one, didn't you? That the God of the highest heavens took human form in bodily form, right? The God of the highest heavens took human form and became closer to us than our closest breath. That is the story of Christmas, a story of incarnation, a story of embodiment. It is, I think, fundamentally a story about how bodies, all bodies, are sacred. A fundamental belief and conviction that God is not abstract but has taken embodiment form, not temporarily but permanently. Bodies, consequently, are sacred. If God has permanently taken material form and deeply participates in the life of the world, who we are as witnesses, how we move with our bodies for and against others, all of that matters deeply. Bodies matter at all times, in life, in death, and what comes after death. The truth that bodies are at the heart of the gospel is strangely, and I say strangely because it is easy to miss, captured in the faith affirmation of Christians. We believe in the resurrection of the body. Sometimes Christians have taken this belief in the resurrection of the body as something that points to the future, and there is nothing wrong with that per se, but one ought to hold that in tension with the fact that death cannot and should not be over-theologized in such a way that bodies suffering injustice fade into the background. It is helpful to remember, for instance, that many of our ancestors that we cherish in our spiritual tradition, like Abraham and Sarah and Hagar and Isaac and Ishmael and other major characters of the Bible, did not believe in life after death. The life they knew was life that came before death. The death they knew was final. It was only later, in the context of extreme injustice and murderous tyranny of powerful empires around the nation of Israel, that a belief in the afterlife began to emerge. The easy emphasis on everlasting life that Christians are sometimes so accustomed to thinking as natural to a Christian sense of things frightens me. I wonder if, in the desire to not let death have the last word, we have disallowed death from having any word at all. Victims and survivors of injustice often wonder how the rest of the world moves on chronologically and continuously through time when their own worlds and lives have come to a sudden stop, to a sudden and striking stop. Does news of death stop us in our tracks? Or do we simply keep moving, hardened by indifference to the need for justice and peace? Despite the many chants of no justice, no peace, arising from the voices of those suffering violence, it seems that peace is often brokered at the cost of justice. Why? It is because we are not paying deep attention. Is it because we are not paying deep attention to suffering bodies, to murdered and missing bodies? For those who believe in the incarnation, this is a hugely important theological question that calls for an intervention amidst forces of death. That's my first of the two theological points. So I hope you're thinking about questions. I'm going to stop talking soon, in less than 5. The second theological proposal is this: let's eat together. That's it. Let's eat together. Seems simple, right? Some of you know I'm teaching a course this semester that is titled Eat, Love, Reflect, inspired by Jesus' transformational encounters around food in the Gospels, which are the first 4 books of the New Testament. The course undertakes an embodied exploration of what it means to love self, God, and neighbor today by similarly eating with others. Throughout, we continuously reflect on our experiences in order to foster a grounded and embodied relationality, this mutuality, this sense of togetherness, that you and I have a primordial bond. Christians participate in a religious ritual that is called by a few names: the Lord's table, Eucharist, communion. What communion involves in a church service is the sharing of bread and grape juice in remembrance of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Today, the practice is mostly symbolic. In its original setting, however, it was a full meal that brought together people across all kinds of differences of gender and class and ethnicity. I say we try that, not as some sort of ad hoc experiment, but as something that is integral to our liturgical life, to our collective life, to our institutional life, not just in churches, although one could certainly begin there, but everywhere. If Sherry Turkle is right, and I think she is, that we are becoming more and more alone together, that we are becoming one ritual at a time, an ever-growing network of imagined but unreal connections, then we have the opportunity today, I think, to stop and reimagine our life together. Communion was modeled after the open table fellowship that Jesus practiced in first century Palestine. It was built on a theology of plenty. A theology of plenty. There was and is enough food and drink for everyone. There was and is enough dignity to go around. There is no need for being entitled to pride of place or food. When people doubted that, Jesus shared food and practiced open table fellowship, where beautiful and miraculous things happened. Open table fellowship was built on a theology of authentically being together, in which Jesus inspired people to reach within the deepest and most centered part of themselves, to recognize that we are the empathy app. Where empathy abounds, faith in God, with some ringtones in between, where faith in God and humanity flourish. Where empathy abounds, love wins.
Thank you, John. I'm glad you came today. I'm glad you made it. And I will say, actually, you stepped in for one of our colleagues. So actually, you did more than just show up today. You showed up early. So thank you for that as well. Our next talk will be, our public lecture will be given by Paul Dick. So if you saw the original schedule, we'd hoped to have him open our series of public lectures, but John more than aptly stepped in for Paul, so thank you for that. And we have time for some questions. We're gonna go until about 12:50 so that people have time to get to their next class. But John has very generously offered to take your questions. We have some microphones. We'd love to be able to hear everyone's voice in their questions. So John Brubaker and Karen Ridd, two of our other instructors from the Ways of Knowing course, have some microphones. They'll pass them around. If you're upstairs, we'd love to hear yours too, but we might need you to, I don't know, shout or run down the stairs and, and tell them to us. Text a friend in the downstairs. John suggested that he could take two or three questions at a time, so we can really get some good discussion going. So I will open the floor now. Please keep your question brief if you can, and make it a question. We're particularly interested to hear what Ways of Knowing students might be wondering after hearing John's lecture, but all are welcome to step forward to the mic. So please do wave down one of the mics and tell us what you're thinking.
Could you say a little more about the death of Jesus, how that relates to your talk? The death of Jesus.
This time I'll stay standing here. The idea is, as Rachel said, maybe gather 2 to 3 questions at a time, and then you can kind of just keep going till 12:50. So I won't wait for too long, but I'll make sure I pause for a few seconds here to see if there are other questions. Take them in sets of 2 to 3, as Rachel suggested.
Oh, there we go. I noticed an interesting use of reconstruction language in your talk, despite the fact that you're talking about something that has never been built before. I was wondering the meaning of that.
Okay, that's 2. And before I respond, I have follow-up questions for the both of you, so don't walk away too soon. How are we feeling, Rachel? Should I get those 2 questions and then we'll see what comes up?
Why don't we start, and that will give other people time
Okay.
to ruminate on their
Okay,
questions.
fantastic.
I think there's more out there.
Okay, so I want each of you to say a little bit about the death of Jesus. What are you trying to ask me about the death of Jesus? Death of Jesus is such a big topic, is there a thing or two that you're thinking about when you say, can you say a little bit about the death of Jesus? And I'll also ask a follow-up to the second question. When you say reconstruction language, like reconstruction language that had to do with what exactly? Reconstruction of what? If you could name that, then it'll help me to respond to your question about, it's never been built, so how do we reconstruct? So reconstruction of what is what I'm looking for.
Well, yes, how that fits, the death of Jesus, how that fits with the incarnation, and how it fits with we're all being together.
Thank you.
I was specifically referring to kind of peace between different people groups. Quite often in the past, that has not occurred. In fact, I don't think we've had world peace occur in history, so I was curious about talking about world peace occurring again when it has not yet occurred.
Aha. Okay. I already sense a disagreement between you and I, but that's okay. We'll talk about that. So the first question is about the death of Jesus, right? About what's the connection between the death of Jesus and the incarnation and the sense of everybody being together. Now, I was a pastor at a church for a few years, and sometimes during Christmas and Easter, I'd actually at both times, both at Christmas and Easter, I always ask the congregation members, hey, so which do you think is more important, Christmas or Easter? You have to choose only one, which is more important. And I haven't really fully figured out myself which is more important. I feel like the question is a trick question. But I think the incarnation is hugely important, and I'm still coming to your question, not yet there, I'll come, right, is the fact that God took bodily form, right? God took bodily form not as some sort of temporary thing, right? Some people thought that God took bodily form just for the time being, just kind of when Jesus was there, and then no more body, right? And that's not quite what Christians believe. Christians believe that God took bodily form in this kind of permanent way, right? What does that mean is something really fascinating to think about. And now I'll come to your question about the death of Jesus. Why did Jesus die? It's a really interesting question to ask, right? Why did Jesus die? And actually, there's more than one response to that question, which is super fascinating, right? I mean, most theological questions tend to have that kind of multiplicity in responses, and certainly this one too. Why did Jesus die? Some people are convinced that Jesus died because Jesus wanted to die. Jesus wanted to die. Didn't Jesus come to earth in order to die? Jesus came to die. And that's one way to look at it. Other people think that Jesus came to live and to let live and to help live and to allow for the flourishing of life. I came that they might have life in all its fullness, abundance. That's kind of what Jesus is after, right? So when Jesus dies, there is a question about, did Jesus come in order to die, and did that death kind of close the loop on something? Or did that death open up something? And I think it's the latter. I think what we find in Jesus' death is a certain kind of bodily solidarity with all people who suffer death, especially those who suffer death via injustice. And Jesus' resurrection, right, by extension also, I think, is the sense of not closing the loop, but opening it up, right? Opening it up to allow for us to recognize that life is still possible and death does not need to have the last word, that death should not have the last word. That's a little bit about what I think. I could say more. I feel like it's a full course maybe. Well, it's a great question. The second question about reconstruction language, I disagree with you. That doesn't mean you're wrong. It just simply means you and I have two different things to say about the same thing, which is fine, Doesn't make one right and the other wrong. But I do think that we have a disagreement. And I think the disagreement is, I think people have done both. People have lived peacefully and people have not lived peacefully. Both of those things. It's not one thing, right? It's not that people always lived happily. No. You and I have read enough history to know that's not the case, right? At the same time, I also don't think that people are always living in this kind of antagonistic way, us versus them, right? Sometimes it seems that way. Sometimes evidence points in that direction, but that's not the whole story, right? And that's where I want to say something like, no, hope is possible. Love is possible, right? Intervention amidst forces of death is possible, right? So I would say my language is not reconstruction, but reimagining. I think people have come before our time that have constructed beautiful, beautiful things that I have referred to in my own lecture remarks here. People have done beautiful, beautiful things, people who came before us. We are not the first ones, at least I certainly am not the first one to say we need to live together. People have said that, they have lived it, they have paid with their lives for believing in such things, right? So I would say it's not reconstruction, but a constant reimagining, right? There's a really neat verse in the Bible that says we're always at the crossroads, right, between life and death. And we'll have to choose what we want every day. You want to choose life or you want to choose death? Both are possible. And I say choose life, which means reimagining more than reconstruction, right? And not to say that there's no reconstruction at all, right? Sometimes, if your basement is flooding, you might need to do a little bit of reconstruction, right? So not to dismiss your concern at all, but just that I see it as like a both-and kind of possibility and not like an either-or kind of thing, right? But I do understand your point of view. I do feel that sometimes. If you're in my classes, you will know that I am not uncomfortable with silence. So I could just, be fine. But it's okay. Take your time. Think about a question or two, and then we'll feel that together. Are thoughts welcome too? Does it have to be a question? That's what you said.
They're welcome. Yep.
But you did say
I did.
question. Yes.
I'll share a thought just because I'm not sure if I have a question yet, but you spoke a lot about embodiment, or I guess sacred bodies, and how we relate to one another. And I'm continually thinking about limitations that we feel in our bodies and in ourselves as humans, and that those are integral to what it is to be human, and how we encompass that in our idea of what is sacred. And yeah, those are my wonderings. Those aren't questions, but I don't know. Is any of that making sense? I wonder, yeah. What do we think? What is sacred even? Like, can we talk about that for a bit? And how does that relate to our different understandings of what is sacred? And yeah, those are thoughts, lots of them.
Yeah, those are big thoughts. Okay. Embodiment and human limitations in the human body. So I present for the most part as an able-bodied person. So I have to watch my mouth because I can't make claims on behalf of people who are not able-bodied to say this is how you should think theologically, right? I can't do that. Now there's a big debate within disability circles whether the terminology should be disability or differently abled. So Nancy Easland, a theologian, wrote a book titled The Disabled God. A fantastic book, The Disabled God, in which she makes the argument that Jesus on the cross is best understood as a disabled God. I bought in. I actually kind of agree, right? Because Nancy Easland will say something like, don't call that differently able, it is a disability. You with an able body do not get to say to somebody with a body that's not able-bodied like yours, that you are also able, you're differently able. But then, here's the catch. There are people who are not able-bodied in the way that certain people are, will say, no, we are differently able, right? So with respect to limitedness, with respect to embodiment, some people believe that in the post-resurrection life, all our disabilities will be healed and that we will be perfect human beings. Perfect, like, I don't know. What's your idea of perfect? Like, I don't know, if you're old school, maybe Sean Connery or something, I don't know. If you're younger, I don't know, who's your guy? Like able-bodied. Like, I don't know, who's it? I don't know. Is it Justin Trudeau? I don't know. Is it, I really don't know, is James Bond, right? Whatever, right? So people think in the post-resurrection life, we're all going to be like this perfect beings. And then those disability theologians will say something like, Jesus in the post-resurrection body still had his wounds, right? Jesus had his wounds in his palms. What does that mean? So that's what I think. Okay.
How does your tenet that the body is sacred lead to the idea that people can instantly generate empathy when there are studies that you pointed out that empathy among college students are already declining by 40%? How do we generate the empathy in order to combat those forces of death that you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, $1 million question. I wish I had a straightforward answer or a response. Mine are only guesses, right? But I'm going to stop to see if there's a second question.
John, there might be a second part to this question here,
Okay.
which was about the sacred, and how do we understand what the sacred is?
How should we think about like natural forces of death as opposed to death from injustice? Like, is that also something we should try to intervene against?
Put me on the spot there. Let me test this guy a little bit. Let me maybe come back to Karen's observation about maybe there was a second part about what does it mean to be sacred. To be sacred doesn't mean to be able. That's my short response is to be sacred doesn't mean being able, right? And if you ask me where's your theological insight there, I'm like Jesus' body. Jesus' body is a disabled body, sacred. All bodies are by extension sacred. If you're all made in the image of God, which is a kind of Christian theological affirmation, all bodies are sacred, irrespective of ability, right? Irrespective of cognitive ability, irrespective of physical ability, irrespective of any kind of ability, right? That's what I would say about being sacred. The other two questions, one was natural forces of death, and then there was the question about empathy, right? I don't know. I think there is no real straightforward answer to this, right? So I say, let's eat together. But eating together, does it like just automatically generate empathy? Not really. Not really. You and I have been to parties of various kinds where there's lots of food, right? People are eating together. But parties are sometimes the most violent spaces, because it looks like people are eating food, but they're doing it in their own little circle and whatnot, right? So how do we generate empathy? I think if we are honest about the fact that despite the technological revolution, despite the Industrial Revolution that makes it seem like we're all connected with each other, right? So if I open up my laptop, I feel like I'm connected to the world. Am I really? Am I really? So I think the Sherry Turkle's point about the fact that maybe we're all just in one space, but just because we're all in one space doesn't mean that we are together. If we are honest enough to recognize that, I think that might be a really great starting point for empathy, right? Then we are able to appreciate how empathy has declined, right? Because this togetherness sometimes is just an illusion. It's an illusion. Like now we're all sitting here together. Like, how do we know what each of us are feeling in ourselves? Nobody knows. Only the person knows, right? So I think that's a good starting point for empathy, not to assume that we are together, but to actually constantly work on it, right? So empathy as a continuous kind of activity rather than just assuming that it's there or not, right? That's what I'd say. About natural forces of death, yeah, that's a great question. As you would have noticed in my talk, I'm talking about not so natural forces of death, right? Violence, about structural injustice. That's kind of what I'm after. So when it comes to natural forces of death, I do believe that as human persons, we are finite, that finitude is not some sort of punishment. Christians sometimes think that our finitude is punishment. That we are just by accident finite. Really, we are not. I'm not so sure. I think we are finite. That's my only response to your question or comment there, other than that we're talking about two different things maybe, but I will say that much about that thing. I think I should not have any last thoughts. I feel like I've had a good say. So maybe I'll just hand things over to you, Rachel. Yeah.
Sir.